like a second opinion.
All right, so we're going to get started here. I think we have as large of a group as we're going to have for tonight. So thank you all for coming out and braving the potential storm of what's out there and joining us for this second in our 4-part summer open house series. Hashtag CFox10. So we're really excited about tonight because, as many of you know, we've got Beth Parker, who's the on-air reporter with Fox 5, and many of you watch her at night and have seen her stories. So we're going to talk a little bit about the good news effect, as we're calling it, since you're one of the few that get to tell all these great human interest stories and share a little bit of what's going on within DC on a regular basis and uncovering all these cool stories, like the little library story that you've got running tonight, the little free library story. But before we do, let me just remind people this is the second of 4, so we have 2 more coming up. We've got Summer Mathis from The Atlantic joining us in a couple weeks, and then in August we'll have someone from USA Today who's a breaking news reporter, and we're going to talk a little bit about covering essentially breaking news and crisis reporting. We're talking earlier today about covering 9/11, and she's going to talk a little bit about the trauma that the toll it takes essentially on reporters when they're covering tough stories like that. But we're on a much happier topic tonight.
Yeah, that's why I do happy stories.
Yeah. So we have people tweeting tonight, and so I'm supposed to remind you, what are we, just, I guess, CFox.com and hashtag CFox10. We've got stuff going on if you want to track it. Okay, so first let me tell you a little bit about Beth if you don't know her, and I suspect that many of you do because this was the event that people wanted to come to see you.
Flattered.
Hear from you. Beth has been with Fox 5 as an on-air reporter since 1998, has won several Edward R. Murrow Awards and 8 Emmy Awards, I believe, for investigative reporting and feature reporting and all kinds of great stories that you've covered. And you've not just been in this market, although it sounds like this is the market that you've always wanted to be in. You've been in Baltimore and Virginia and North Carolina, and so I know we're very happy that you're in this market and happy to have you here tonight. Beth is also on Twitter at Beth Parker Fox 5. Yep. And so you know we're going to be, you and I, people can't really hear us using this. This is really just for Don's purposes over here.
Oh, okay.
But we're going to just make sure that we are talking into this.
I wondered. I thought it seemed like it wasn't.
I know. It's a little strange. It's a little strange. I just wanted to play the part here. All right, so here's the deal. We're doing this as best as we can here in a little bit of a TED style. So we've got a timer that's going to keep us going here. Mr. Fox back there is keeping our time. And we're going to see what we can do in 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. But you and I have 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, let's go. All right, so a lot of us watch you on the local news, and we see that you, night after night, get to tell these great stories of what's going on in DC, and you tell them from really interesting perspectives. So I want you to tell me a little bit about what's your definition of a good story, knowing that there's a lot of people after you every day to say, cover this and cover that, and you've got to make a decision on what really rises to the top. So tell us a little bit about what's the definition of a good story in your mind.
Well, the number one component, do you want me to hold that? That's fine. The number one component of a good story for me is that it has to be personal. It has to be impactful in some way. So we're always looking for a way to really tell somebody's story within a story. So I was just talking with someone the other day who was pitching a story about a playground that's handicapped accessible, and they were trying to get money for this playground. And I kept saying, I gotta have a family, I gotta have a kid, I gotta have somebody who uses this playground that you're trying to expand or fix up. Because to me, you have to sort of build the story around an individual, because I think it's what makes people, it's what's compelling. And then the other thing for me is having great sound and great video. So if you're trying to pitch stories, you always want to be thinking, you know, what does this sound like? What's this going to look like? Because I think that those are the things that kind of transport people, you know, when they hear all that natural sound at a story, or, you know, the guy with the chainsaw or something splashing in the water, it kind of transports people to where it's happening. And so to me, that's good storytelling, just making people feel like they're there.
Yeah, cool. Cool. So this series is, as you know, is about pushing the envelope in storytelling. So finding people who are doing new and interesting ways in how to tell a story, both in their technique, but also in the tools that they're using. So I got to see you in action a few weeks ago, telling a story about a new campaign in Montgomery County on disability etiquette and awareness on physical disabilities. And you took this really interesting approach of saying, I want to tell this story from the perspective of someone who is living with a physical disability. So it's one thing to say there's a campaign out there, and that's a good thing, but I'm going to attach a GoPro to a wheelchair and walk around Rockville Town Center and see truly what it's like from his eyes. So we know you're using GoPros more often. You're using maybe iPhones in a different way. So tell us about how technology is changing how you tell a story.
So it's a good thing that my bosses aren't here because they know me as like the GoPro stalker. Because when we didn't have GoPros, I was always like, hey, when are we getting those GoPros? And it went on for like 2 years. They're not that expensive actually, but don't tell my bosses I said that. But you know, the GoPros go into places that we can't take this huge camera that weighs 40 pounds, which is the camera we need because it looks great on TV. But I did a story the other day on a bus driver who'd been driving bus for like 60 years, and you know, we were able to take the GoPro and stick it right under the gas pedal, you know, and you get this shot looking up at the guy, and you know, that's something we could never do. And it's the same kind of thing I was talking about a second ago, just this idea of taking people right to the place. So we use the GoPros a lot. And there's a lot of other technology that people don't think about that I think make my stories a lot better than they were in the past because it's sort of time-saving technology. So our cameras now, not the GoPros, but the big cameras, have a little SD card in them, just like what you use, you know, in your camera at home, in your still camera. And so when I'm in Leesburg doing a story, I can sit in the car, pop that into my laptop, and I have my whole story logged, and I know exactly what sound bites I'm using and what video I'm using, so that by the time I get back, it gives me extra time to tweak the story and really make it more compelling in the writing, and then it gives the photographer and the editor a lot of extra time to put it together. So it takes a little of the pressure off the deadline crunch.
Yeah, cool. All right, so on that topic, of efficiency, there was a Pew report that came in not too long ago about local TV news and how back, I guess it was about 10 years ago, 31% of stories, of local TV news stories, 31% of them were over a minute long. Now it's 20% of stories are over a minute long. So significant decrease in the length of the story. And yet you still have to get the same story out there. You still have to get the message out there, but in less time. So how have you battled that, telling a great story with fewer seconds?
So, well, I actually am probably the exception to the rule on that because I happen to work at a place where they will give us extra time. So my stories are a lot longer than, like if one of my competitors does the exact same story, I'll probably have 30 seconds more, which in TV is a lifetime, yeah. So most of my stories are about 2 minutes long, or if I'm pushing my luck, like 2:10.
Wow.
But there's a station in town, I won't say which one, that has a rule, no stories longer than 1:20, and there's one that is no stories longer than 1:30. And they actually will float the story, as we call it. They'll drop it down in the show to cut 8 seconds out of the story. So, and you don't want to miss slots. So that's a big deal if they're willing to not air the story. So they feel really strongly. And I think a lot of that has been sort of a response to the way viewers are reacting, that they want everything sort of quickly. But that was happening before Twitter and before a lot of the social media changes. So I have been fortunate that I have bosses who will, if I go to them and say, hey, this is really good, and I make my case, this is why I need an extra 20 seconds or 30 seconds, they will most likely give it to me, unless it's a huge news day.
So what do they have to cut to give you that 20 seconds? Like, what else has to tighten?
Well, I shouldn't tell you my. I always go up to them because I think there's a TV news joke about the water skiing squirrel. There's sort of this joke. So I always say, don't you have a water skiing squirrel you could kill out of the show? But you know, typically they're cutting either a VO, which is a little 15 or 20 second voiceover on something completely unrelated, or I think the producers most of the time have an idea going into a show this is what I could take or leave. And so they know going in, because sometimes someone will just talk longer, or there'll be breaking news or a live shot that runs long. So they have a sense of what they can kill. And but they also have to hit meters. They have to, because of ratings, they have to hit certain breaks at certain times during the show. So they have to be careful too about not letting a reporter go too long, because they have to answer to their bosses about that.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, thanks. I threw up.
No, that's okay.
All right, so you mentioned Twitter, so we're going to talk about social for a second. So what is Fox 5's stance on breaking news on social, on Twitter or any other platform, versus waiting until that evening news broadcast to break the news? It feels as if people go first to social to see what the breaking news is, and so you can't always wait until the evening news to break that story. So what's the station stance on that? How do you manage it? Breaking news, do you wait? Do you do it on social?
It kind of depends on what it is. There are a lot of things. If I have an exclusive story that I know no one else has, or I'm confident that no one else has, we'll wait. Depending on what it is, but a lot of times we'll wait, and then I would normally be tweeting during the day about what my story is, but I would tweet it at like 5:05 so that no one else can confirm it, so they don't have enough time. So we do that. But especially if things happen much earlier in the day and it's a big, impactful kind of story, a lot of times we do break stories on the web now. And I think there is kind of a push, and we're constantly under deadline and trying to find creative ways to still make the news when it airs compelling. So, you can't say anymore, hey, here's this really cool video, because everyone's seen it. And if you run that tease at 8 o'clock at night and say coming up at 10, anybody who's sitting on their sofa is going to just pop on their phone and there's that video. Yeah, so you have to say, what's the meaning of that? Or find some way to advance it or to make it compelling, to give someone a reason to watch at 10 o'clock.
Okay, cool. All right, 2 minutes left. So let's see if I can get 2 questions in. I know. All right. So, so what's next? If we're talking about the future of storytelling and pushing the envelope, what are you excited about? What's happening in the newsroom? What's happening in local news? What's happening in journalism? Where you see things evolving that excites you?
Well, I think a lot of people are, a lot of people who've been around news for a long time tend to think, social media and Twitter, and maybe have some negative views of it if they've been around for a while. I actually think it's a really cool way to spread your stories around. Like when I try to do a lot of positive stories now, because I was tired of doing sad stories. And so, my stories, if they catch on social media, it has a huge audience, and you can sort of advance stories and move them around in a way that you couldn't before. And I find that that's exciting. And I think a good story is just a good story. And so it still travels. You just have to find kind of compelling ways to tell them.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So last question. What's the one story that you've covered, if you can think of one, that still sticks with you as having had such an impact on you? One of the great stories that you were so proud and excited to tell in your career.
Well, I have a really recent one that I really loved, which is a story about a guy that we did at the end of May, and he is a blind runner, and he runs in the Special Olympics. And I had gotten an email in the winter from his coach who said, hey, I've got this guy, and he's a blind runner, and I'm wondering, I watch your news, I wonder if you want to do a story. And I'm like, a blind runner? That's fascinating. So it turns out that he runs in his lane, and his coach runs next to him and tells him, left, left, right, right, and go straight. And so he's like 55 years old and just started running 10 years ago. And he was this incredibly compelling, positive force. Like the second we got out of the car at this track where he was going to run for us, I was blown away by this guy. And people were really touched by him and by his story and how, everything that he's overcome. And then also, it really impacted viewers. So we had viewers calling us saying, hey, I want to buy that guy running shoes before the state Special Olympics. And so we did a follow-up story with a lady who worked downtown and met her at City Sports. And they actually, she bought some shoes for him, had never met him. And then while we were standing there, I said, so what made you do this? And she said, well, I had cancer years ago, and I was always a runner, and I stopped running. And then I saw this guy, and it made me go running. And so that's the kind of thing where, I mean, obviously she was touched by it. And so so those are the cool stories that have an impact, yeah.
That's awesome. All right, I've run out of my time.
Ah.
So now I'll turn it over to all of you and see what additional questions you have for Beth.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Beth, and I work with Carrie here at 5's. Thanks for being here.
Sure.
Question for you. A lot of time, I was talking about this with some of our attendees tonight. A lot of times some of the clients we work with have really heart-wrenching stories. And, we're talking about good stories here, but can you talk a little bit about striking the balance between, youth in foster care or other issues that are really, there are some really bad things that happen to these kids. How do we, I would like to think that everyone would be interested in telling the good story, but I think that there's a degree of, conflict makes a good story. So what we find is we don't want to dwell on the negative and we want to give people hope. Can you talk a little bit about how we might strike the balance in enticing a reporter to cover a story like that while trying to get them to focus on the positive?
That's interesting. Well, I think a lot of it is about the timing. So if it's a foster care issue, it's great to do a story or pitch a story like that when there's something happening on the Hill or some new law. But I also find a lot of times when stories on the surface seem really sad, a lot of times there's something hopeful about them. If it's like sort of a character in the story or something that someone's doing to help somebody else. So a lot of times I find that that's a great way to get my bosses to bite on a story, is if they feel like there's kind of a twist there that has sort of a feel-good, and I know there's a lot of negative stuff on the news, but the response that I get to positive stories is dramatically greater, and I tell my bosses that all the time. I haven't totally convinced them, but I'm working on it. So,
and that's a really important point to make, that someone can pitch you a great story, but you have to go pitch the story.
Yes. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and I do that all the time. I really try to set up a lot of stories. So while I'm out doing one story on deadline, I'm always emailing people and calling and, and sending things to my bosses saying, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? To try to kind of get a little bit of a day ahead if I can. And there are days where I just have to do whatever the news of the day is, or I'm at a trial, or I'm at a murder. But a lot of days I try to set things up just because I think people are kind of craving positive news.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Sure. Hi.
Hi, I'm Ollie. I'm a journalist. I'm a news Twitter stalker.
Oh, right. You tweeted me earlier today. Yeah. You seem harmless.
I am, mostly.
Mostly.
So one thing that I was wondering is, how do you go about finding some of these great stories that you do find, something like the little libraries or the kid with the crayons? Those aren't things that you're seeing in the news that are cropping up on Hill dockets all the time. So kind of what do you do to kind of get out there and talk to people and find out what is going on?
A lot of it is things that I observe, actually. So this little library story that we did today, there were 2 of them right near Channel 5 that have been there for several months. And I was out riding a bike with my son in my neighborhood, and I noticed that 3 of them had popped up in my neighborhood. And then last week there were 2 more, and I was like, what's going on with these little tiny libraries? And do you know what this is? It's like a little box in someone's yard, kind of looks like a birdhouse, sort of. And so you can take a book and leave a book, and it's just a free little library. So so that's sometimes just observing things. I also find that once you do a lot of these kinds of stories, people will write to me directly and say, here's the deal. But I think I told you, Carrie, the story about how when we did the blind runner story, I got an email after the fact from the Special Olympics saying, hey, where'd you get that story idea? And so I think it's an example of, and it's obviously a fabulous organization, but there are things happening kind of right under your nose sometimes that don't always get pitched. And so, so it's kind of a combination of things. The crayon story, that was from a press release. the foundation that we did a story about a young man who grew up here in D.C. who has started this program collecting crayons that would normally be thrown out at restaurants. Because the waiters and waitresses have been told they have to throw away all these crayons. So he collects them and gives them to shelters, and he has them all over the world now, some in refugee camps in Syria, and he won a big award a couple of weeks ago. And so I just pitched it as, hey, here's a local kid, and he won a $36,000 award. Well, the mayor still does regular press conferences, and your boss, the mayor. And I think that those are really valuable to people who work those beats, because even if there's not necessarily a story that comes out of it, it's sort of background information, and I think it educates them every week about what's happening, or it might plant the seed for a story down the road, or that kind of thing. I feel like it's most effective if someone covers the beat all the time. So like at the Department of Health, I don't know that you guys have the same reporters covering you all the time, or maybe you do.
It depends on the issue.
Okay, like medical marijuana is, okay.
We just released our HIV report. You guys have somebody there.
Yep, yep.
So I'm always curious because, we put a lot of energy into making sure press conferences are great and backdrops are good, and I try to add that human interest, but, just is there value, out of that event?
Yeah, I think that, especially for TV, I think there's more value for print maybe, and even for radio, but for people looking for visuals, we perceive that as a really boring setting. Yeah, so we call it BOPSA, bunch of people sitting around. So yeah, we're like, we can't go to that.
You specifically, I tend to think you're going to cover a story if you're not seeing it other places, right?
Yes, and that's more of something that comes from our management. They want us to be the only people with the story, or the first people.
Right.
It's okay if everybody else does it the next day.
Right. But you're not going to take a story if you've seen it on ABC the night before. So you should be thinking about that too.
Yeah,
just making sure that the story is somewhat special to you.
It's fresh, yeah. Yep. Yep.
Any others? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Nancy Wood, and I'm with Girl Scouts.
Hi.
And my biggest barrier pitching stories to the media is the litmus test of, is this news? And, there may not be news. There's just, it's a good, feel-good story. Those little boxes that you did at the libraries.
Oh, right.
Girl Scouts do those all the time for bronze awards
Is that
in
right?
neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So, and when I pitch that, no one's interested. There's no
Interesting.
news value to it.
Yeah.
So is it just finding the right?
Some of it's
reporter?
timing. Some of it's finding the right reporter, and then some of it's timing, I think. And, I'll tell you when we are just hurting is on holiday weeks. Like last week, leading up to the 4th of July, it was like the 2nd and it's the 3rd and everybody's out of town. If I'm you, I would jump on those weeks, and I would say, hey, I know it might be a little slow over there this week. Or like, like the week between Christmas and New Year's, and people are just looking for stories. So
No more vacations for me.
yeah. No Thanksgiving dinner for you. But you could get it all set up ahead of time, and so just a thought.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. For me, I have to be right.
Of course.
So whether I'm on like a breaking news story so I don't tweet something unless I know it's right. I think there are people maybe in different situations where there's pressure that pushes them more to get things out there on social media and break stories that way. So, I think it's an issue, and it's definitely something that people in newsrooms are watching closely and trying to make sure that that it's reined in. But it's a balancing act to try to sort of please everybody and win. But it's better to be right than first, we always say. So.
Great. Well, thank you.
Sure.
We'll wrap it up there, but thank you for being a good sport and letting us ask you.
Oh, of course.
Unexpected
That's all right.
questions there. I've gotten the chance to really get to know Beth over the last few months, and I think every chance I have to sit down with you, I not only learn something new, but I just appreciate you more. You've got this great sense of wanting to tell these great stories and wanting to elevate these stories, and you have such a good sense of humor in the process too. So
thank you.
You're really a gem for for Fox to have.
Oh, I appreciate that.
So thank you.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
All right, I think we have a lot of food in the conference room, so head that way, or you can, or you can go to my office, which is the bar.
Let's get to the serious.